You are now listening to The Big Trade with Peter Pham, enlightening conversations for maximum market returns.
Ole, welcome to the Big Trade series. It's great to finally have you on. You wrote a really fascinating book titled Poker, a Parody of Capitalism. Why don't you tell us briefly about some of the history, and we can dive into some of the key ideas in the book.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me on the podcast. So the book is about, part of the book is about poker itself, to sort of explore sort of philosophical and psychological components of poker. And part of the book is also, that's why I call it the parody of capitalism, because I want to sort of explore, so what can poker tell us about life as such, or capitalism, or whatever you like to call it. So in a way you can say I try to read poker kind of in the same way that we would read a great piece of art or a great novel or something, where we would say, okay, what can this teach us about life and society and the times we live in? So, as you said, part of the book is, it sort of writes the history of capitalism, or the history of poker, but makes it sort of parallel to the history of capitalism. So I sort of compare different forms of poker with different stages of capitalism. And of course we know that poker is, or at least it used to be, maybe it still is, but it's very connected to American history and American society and also American capitalism. So, and it emerged in, or started to develop in the 19th century. And at the time it was very, the kind of poker that was played at the time was a very simple form of poker. It was called flat poker, and it then later evolved into what we know today as draw poker. And it was basically a game, more or less a game of chance, but also a game of being able to hold your own when you take big risks and being courageous and stuff like that. And that sort of corresponds very nice to the way that capitalism at the time was you could call like a frontier capitalism. It was like exploring or expanding capitalism into the West, and poker was a game that was sort of played on the frontier between what was already capitalism and what was not yet capitalism. So it was about being able to face these unknown risks. And what we then see in the 20th century is that poker evolved into something that's much more mathematical, much more rational, if you like, much more logical. And it was the most popular form of poker in the beginning of the 20th century. What we know as 7-card stud, where you can see a lot of cards. There's a lot of open cards, which means that it's a game that lends itself very much to probability theory and logical thinking, and that corresponds to the kind of capitalism we would call Fordist capitalism, which is about optimization, management, efficiency, calculation, all these kinds of things.
Right.
And then sort of the final stage is what we have today is perhaps what we could call financial capitalism, and that corresponds to the most popular game today, which is Texas Hold'em, which is kind of a hybrid of the two. So on the one hand we have this, you have to read your opponent, you have to face up to risk and all this, but at the same time you also have to be good at rational thinking and calculation and stuff like that. So in a sense you could say the kind of capitalism we have today is kind of a hybrid of the two forms. There's a lot of calculation, but there's also a lot of this sort of risk-taking.
Yeah, what's so interesting, Ole, is I've heard that the game of Monopoly, one of its origins was also to probably more directly even teach the original lessons of capitalism from both the good aspects and the bad aspects. And then ultimately, I think it came out also in, I think, the early part of the century. And what had happened was eventually, once it got bought out by big corporations such as Warner Brothers, Parker Brothers, I think what happened was that the elements of the lesson aspects of capitalism were removed more so to accentuate the fun aspects, which is the beating of people and the psychological joy that one gets by defeating your opponent, and actually the psychological low one feels losing to an opponent, and the magnitude of dissatisfaction after the game is played. So it's interesting when I'm hearing what you're saying and then comparing to what I understand about Monopoly. But let's get into some of the more interesting concepts that you discuss about in the book, and I'm still trying to grasp this concept. Is you discuss about how certain hands in poker are perceived with relative value because you are playing against other people. Could you elaborate more about this idea?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that initially got me interested in the game, so I like poker, I like playing games, but what really fascinated me was the complexity that goes into calculating the value of a hand. And of course, there's and one of the things I do in the book is I try to unpack that philosophically, because I kind of had the sense that there were sort of different dimensions to this calculation. So of course, the first thing, of course, you look at the value of the hand itself. Well, if you have a 10 and a queen in hearts, then of course you look at that, but you also have to take into account a lot of other things. You have to take into account how has what has happened before, how have the other players played before in the hand, but also in previous hands. So you have to sort of have the history of the game. And you also have to sort of be able to figure out the type of players that the other, the type of players that your opponents are. So there's an element of probability, but there's also an element of psychology in the game, and that I try to sort of unwrap philosophically. I am very inspired by a philosopher called Slavoj Žižek.
Yes.
And what he does is that, so he has this, I wouldn't call it a model, but he has this threefold distinction between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary.
Okay.
So the real is kind of, in a way, you could kind of say it's sort of the material component of the world, but it's also something that's beyond what we can control and beyond what we can perhaps understand. And that's, for me, sort of corresponds to the element of chance. That's kind of what gives the dynamics to poker, is that there is this element of chance that we cannot control. But then, of course, in a way, we try and control it by using probability theory. And that corresponds to the domain of what he refers to as the symbolic. So we can kind of calculate, in a way, what the probability. Of course, we can't predict how the cards are going to come, but we can sort of calculate probabilities. And then finally, there's what he calls the imaginary, and that refers to that whatever we do as humans, we always sort of think, how does the other look at me? We know this from religion. There's this idea that God is looking at us all the time, so we kind of structure our actions in terms of what would he think about what I do now, if you believe in God. But if you don't believe in God, you believe in other things. Maybe you believe in the market, or you believe in other entities. And that's also what poker is all. That's another very important component of poker, is always imagining how the others look at me when I do something. So of course, that's the element of bluffing, but also just structuring your game in a way to put on a certain appearance, so that the other players think that you have a certain hand, and so forth. And then all these three elements then combine into the calculation of what's my position now in the game.
Ole, if we take out the behavioral aspects of the opponent that you're playing and strictly look at hands, for example, how do these ideas reflect basically markets from the perspective that hands have a finite possibility of permutations, as opposed to markets where the discussion of like a 10 sigma or like a 10 standard deviation event or no maximum threshold to volatility is extremely possible. And that's like, for example, in some instances, there have been people that have been extraordinarily lucky. And there are situations in which people have been extraordinarily not lucky and have either made fantastic sums of wealth or have either lost tons of money and went bankrupt. Even though poker does reflect some of these aspects, I don't know if it reflects the full magnitude of, like, say, for example, 10 sigma events because of the threshold and permutations in hands. What do you think about that?
No, I think I certainly think you're right, in the sense that yes, you can be surprised in a game of poker, and yes, you can win a hand where you have only very, very few outs, and then on the final card you do get the card that you need. So these things do happen, but it is true that what happens in poker, it happens within sort of a limited framework. You don't, whereas the market, of course, is. It's also one of the. So I've talked about the similarities between poker and capitalism, but there's also, very obvious differences, and one of them is that the market is in a way much more open to the world. So a lot of, in principle, everything that happens in the world can have an impact on the market, and that's also why we can see that, that the scope of surprise, if you like, in the market is much larger, and that's so. And coming back to what you said about Monopoly, I think what games such as Monopoly, but also poker, what they provide us with are the opportunity to sort of play with capitalism, or play with some of the things that are going on in capitalism. And of course, and for instance, so if you're not wealthy, if you're not a hedge fund manager, if you don't have access to the financial markets, then poker is a place where you can still sort of explore some of the things, some of the thrills of being in the market and betting on virtual values and stuff like that. So it's kind of also the working man's way of participating in the market, or playing with capitalism, and in a way, poker provides, or games provide a safe environment. Of course, you can also lose all your money in a game of poker, but there is something, precisely because it's sort of a closed environment in a way, and of course it also goes the other way. In a way, I think there's something. One of the things that I don't like about some of the things that are going on in the market is that they may have an effect on people who have not asked to be part of the market, and yet they're still affected by some of the things that goes on in the market. Where I think, in a way, you can say that poker is more. There's another honesty in poker, because at least, yes, you can lose all your money, but you can still decide whether you want to be part of the game of poker or not. And I think that's one of the big problems of the way that financial capitalism has developed today, is that people who have not asked to be affected by or be part of some sort of game in the market, if you like,
right.
they are still affected by it. Yeah. So that's kind of that's one of the things that sometimes we use this phrase casino capitalism, and we use it in a derogatory way to say that capitalism is like a casino or something. But I think that's wrong. It's not like a casino, because a casino is something that you can enter it, but you can also exit it.
Right.
That doesn't apply to capitalism.
I think with that, since you were already headed towards that direction, I guess I love to share how I address some of those issues, because you do bring up some very valid points, and I think the quote unquote hedge, for example, to some of this is like, yes, let's accept that we are fortunate enough to basically live in developed societies, and there are going to be negatives and positives to it. Now, yes, we are all part of if you want to use the analogy of poker, right? We are all bystanders even to the games that are being played, either directly or indirectly without us. Now, I think the approach that an individual needs to take in this circumstance is, as opposed to not understanding the rules of poker and the players in poker and where poker is being played and how money is being made and lost, one needs to, through their own individual freedoms, be able to understand these aspects as much as possible. And therefore, by understanding what is happening, there are situations where you can either participate directly or indirectly to either hedge yourself or protect yourself from all these environmental or what you want to call like economic forces and factors. So even, for example, if I'm at a casino, I know that I can, at least by just standing around, at least I'm going to get some free drinks, right? Typically, and I might be able to get some free snacks. I might even get a free hotel suite if I'm lucky. So I think that we need to address that same situation. So there's so many different like multinationals, oligarchs, plutocrats, technocrats, and yes, it can be extremely overwhelming. We have very little control, but believe it or not, through the development of, say, this casino or this highly developed casino, or through markets, you can still try to exploit some of the inefficiencies or some of those inevitable trends that are going to be happening. I think one of the great ones that I've been developing right now is the criticism towards Hillary Clinton's preference towards big banks, right? That's a big commentary, and it sounds like it could be extremely scandalous, borderline corrupt, obviously open up many different investigations. Now, this could highlight and accentuate all the wrongs in the world, but I think the way that one needs to address that is say, hey, what are those banks? Can I invest in any of those banks? What would be the long-term trend or secular trend that could develop or transpire due to the basically crony capitalism that is happening? Now, I'm not saying it's a wonderful thing, but at least now I do not become a victim of, say, economic policies, foreign policies. I've now actually been able to correlate some of my wealth towards what the 1% are doing. And I think that is an interesting way, and then ultimately what you want to do with your profits is your prerogative, but I think that's an interesting way to address this as opposed to creating all these mental barriers to the whole situation.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think a wide range of phenomena fit under what you're talking about, this idea of hedging. But maybe you could distinguish. So some people, like the examples you give, will probably try and hedge themselves within the market.
Right.
So to say, take certain positions so that if this happens, then at least I'll be fine. But I think there's also a lot of people who hedge themselves outside of the market, which could be, so I need to build some personal relationships. So if there's a huge crisis, I have a lot of friends, or I have a strong community, or I have people I can rely on. So that's another form of hedging. And then, of course, you have the sort of prepper hedging. I think that's an interesting phenomena. It's like a radical form of hedging, in to say, well, I believe the whole thing is going to collapse. I think I will hedge against that. I will buy gold. I will buy weapons. I will buy canned beans. I will buy all these kinds of things. So I think this idea of hedging, I think is a very fundamental thing or fundamental strategy for many human beings. But I think we should also be open to. And maybe you could also say, well, maybe the good society is the society that provides many people the opportunity to hedge against risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any ideologies, social economic factors that are of keen interest, believe it or not, due to the financialization of the global markets and the whole world, basically, is that you now do have that ability and flexibility to be able to allocate resources and assets to either speculation or investment towards some of these ideas, and then also be able to choose how you want to allocate your capital gains, for instance, to, say, for example, express whatever it is you so please. So I think that is important. I'll give you a great example that, if, like, looking back at it now, you could just say to me, Peter, this is extremely obvious. But it's not obvious because the inefficiency was not resolved until basically the whole thing played out. A great one is this, is people discuss about George Bush's relationship with big oil companies, right? The Bush family and their connection to big oil. So as you know, George W. Bush came into power in the year 2000. So clearly then, if you have all these factors and you have all this corruption and lobbying and all this stuff that everyone is talking about, why not just buy oil companies? And why not just speculate in oil? Which subsequently went up several fold during that 8-year time horizon. It's what we would call basically an event trade, but basically you're welcome to do whatever you want with your capital gains after, but as opposed to just writing, for example, there's going to be many people that write papers or occupy Wall Street or something like that. There are other ways that you can capture what you've observed as a consistent trend, and then be able to express whatever message you so please now that you have more resources to do so.
Yeah. I think I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm kind of thinking it would be interesting. So today we map different political orientations or parties or ideologies, if you like, on the basis of their sort of, okay, what is their vision of the good life or the good society? But it would be interesting to do the reverse, to say, let's try and map different political groupings or political orientation in terms of their ideas of the impending catastrophe or the impending or whatever risks. So kind of saying what would be if we look at different political orientations as hedging strategies, you could then ask, what are they hedging against? I think it could be, one could, now that we have you have the election coming out in the come up in the U.S., one could ask oneself, so if you vote for Trump, if you like him, maybe it's because you share his vision of catastrophe, and if you vote for Hillary, it's because you share her vision of catastrophe, and you think that by voting for each or either one of them, you kind of think you're hedging yourself against that that scenario. Yeah,
I think
I
a
haven't
more
fully thought this through, but yeah.
I think a more interesting way to do this is basically by looking at the major economic schools of thought. As basically we're basically in the year 2016-17 now, and thinking about which economic schools of thought will remain sustainable and kind of like anti-fragile to technological innovation, and then do some rational deduction of what is going to be able to survive and not survive. And one of the interesting trends, this is related to some of the things that you discuss about as well, is actually about the idea of trust, basically. Now, as you mentioned in the Industrial Revolution, it caused institutions to become a barrier, because prior to that, you and I would just be working with each other. You would be lending me money. I'd be providing you some interest on that, because we'd be living in a very small community, and our relationship and trust would be based on that. But now we have to work, or at least during post-industrial revolution, we'd have to work with massive institutions, relying on all this bureaucracy, all these legal documentation and lawyers. But now, as you've seen through like Uber, Airbnb, that and through blockchain, which is also like Bitcoin, for example, that whole idea of kind of like networks again, of relationships, minimizing the importance of institutions, really does go back to basically only a few major political ideologies or social political or economic schools of thoughts that can actually be sustainable in environments where you can build trust, gain trust, lose trust amongst a community of people, and be able to trade and interact with them. So I think that that's what's interesting, and as indicated through these elections and through the financial crisis, individuals have actually lost a lot of trust for big institutions, be it government institutions or corporates.
I think today we're sort of at a moment in history where the 20th century, and perhaps even also before, has been marked by the build-up of these huge systems. So kind of in order to succeed, you have to be able to, or at least that used to be the case, you had to learn how to operate within big systems. I know, so I teach at the Copenhagen Business School, and part of what we teach our students is to be able to interact with large systems. But at the same time, I think we're also at a point of in history where it's not really clear if the future is going to be the continuation of this, like, okay, so even bigger systems, even bigger corporations, even bigger, perhaps even monopolies, if you like, or whether we're going to see a shift towards smaller systems or other kinds of systems, say Bitcoin and other similar things. And I'm not sure how this is going to play out. I think I see trends going in both directions. I see smaller systems or smaller things sort of being developed and being successful, but I also see some of the big systems becoming even bigger and even more sort of pervasive and inevitable and whatever you like. So I think, in a way, one could say that, so the historical question today, and perhaps also the political question, is: are we going to have a world with few large systems, or are we going to have a world with many small systems?
I think you'll see a divergence of the two. You'll see the 1% continuously compound the growth of these very large systems as the majority, the 99%, start to aggregate into these small systems. Now, obviously, the wealth, all the power, the military might is still consolidated into that, but slowly that will have to erode in some shape or form and then trickle down.
Because I think I think in a way you're right, but I also think that some of these big systems, they seem to be sort of crumbling is a strong word, but I think there's fractures within some of these systems. Take, for instance, like the military. If you look at it, say the U.S. military, or if you look at it from the outside, you think, oh, it's so big and they can do whatever they want in the world and they can conquer everyone. But at the same time, there's also symptoms or signs that within the military, people are, ultimately the military consists of people. So there's divergencies within this, and there's people in there who don't believe in that system.
Right,
so
right.
they kind of break out or do something else or refuse or whatever. Like, of course, Snowden is the primary examples, but there's many things going on in there. So there's no
perhaps the better figure to use is basically global debt, right? Which is basically $150 trillion right now, and that's on state levels, right? Then when you look at municipal levels, you look at countries like China, for example, and then when you look at basically subprime grade corporate debt, which has been artificially inflated post the financial crisis, as well as many companies are chasing higher yields. The key fracture there is that the big systems are now sustainable because of debt. Now, what's interesting is these smaller systems, they're actually sustaining due to profits, actually. And it will be interesting because in order for that big system to continue to sustain and drive, there needs to be avenues of rent that they can seek from the economy and from the political entities in power, which we're actually seeing right now through the elections. So I think that those are some of the two massive trends that are consistently happening right now. And once again, the audience should be observers, or your students even should be observers of this, to understand this dichotomy in order to strive or survive in this coming new age, basically.
No, I hope they are. I hope they are observers of this. And it's interesting what you say about debt, because on the one hand, debt has this. It looks like this omnipotent force that sort of encompasses everything. You have student debt, you have medical debt, you have everyone's more or less in debt. So on the one hand, it appears to be this force that there's just nothing you can do about it. And at the same time, it's also something that can be very fragile, because ultimately it depends. Debt is a social relation, and it feeds on the debtor's obligation to pay back his or her debt.
Right.
But I think one could easily see that unraveling.
Right. And that goes exactly back to that. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that goes exactly back to how this conversation kind of started, which was what we were talking about in terms of trust, right? Because the key currency, which is the reserve currency from the United States, is strictly based on the trust and credit of the United States.
We hope you enjoyed this mastermind session. If you'd like to contact Peter Pham or Phoenix Capital, please email info@phx-cap.com.